I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That, and today we're building a modern sofa. Last year I made a modern outdoor chair for the front porch, and ever since then I've been wanting to make this love seat. You can build this out of 2x4s, but I'm gonna use these big beams, but that means I gotta do a lot of milling. So let's get going.
And these suckers are massive. It felt like an Imperial Star Destroyer cruising through my planer. But after I had the faces smooth, I needed to check the moisture level of the beams. If the boards are too wet, my project is going to be warping over time. I grabbed my Orion 950 pinless moisture meter from Wagner Meters and I calibrated it for cedar to take the readings. But I was reading around 12.5%, which is good, but I needed to check the center after I cut up the beams. I took the lumber over to my joiner to finish prepping for the resawing. The joiner uses the flat face that I made over on the planer as a reference, and it cuts the side running across the table at a perfect 90 degrees to the face. I've always been partial to 90-degree angles. They just always seem like, I don't know, the right angle, I guess. Now, milling wood from rough lumber is no easy chore, but a bandsaw sure makes it a lot easier to get what you want. I set up the saw to cut a little over 1.5-inch segments so that the boards will have a finished thickness right at 1.5 inches, which is the same as a 2x4. And when you're cutting these long boards, make sure to use outfeed support too. But as much as I love my bandsaw, make sure you're wearing some hearing protection when you do any resawing.
Want to hear the most annoying sound in the world?
I'm not sure if there's any more annoying sounds than that of a good resawing. Let me know in the comments if I'm missing one. But of course, it is totally worth the sound, and after all the cutting, it gave me 13 boards to work with.
All right, I got these boards all resawed down into smaller 1x4s, but one thing I do want to check is that the outside is the same as the inside as far as moisture and dryness.
The Orion 950 has a temperature and humidity sensor that calculates the equilibrium moisture content, or EMC, for the space that it's in. It's basically the percentage where lumber stops losing moisture. In my shop, EMC was at 11.6%. It's really the game-changing feature on this meter, and it's got a great 7-year warranty also. And now I could check the center of those beams against this number.
So this one is around 11.5, 12.5, and this is on the outside, and the inside board is like 13, 12.5, 12.6. So that's good. That means that I can go ahead and move forward and mill this lumber, and it's not going to move around a lot because it's close to my equilibrium. If you want to find out more about the Orion 950, I've got a link down below in the description, and thanks to Wagner Meters for being a sponsor of this video.
Now these boards still had at least one rough face from the bandsaw, so I went back to the planer to cut it smooth. I also took them down to my final thickness of 1.5 inches. Now from there, I was in the home stretch of the milling. I made one more trip back to the joiner to fix any of those beautiful right angles that may have gotten out of whack from the resawing. And then I could finally start trimming the boards to their widths as I needed at the table saw. Whew.
So milling your own wood does take a lot of time, does take a lot of machines, but it is rewarding, and save a little green while you're at it.
Now, so if you ever need some good firepower to convince your significant other why you need to buy all these machines, just show them the video up until this point and describe all the wonderful things that you can make for him or her with these tools. Good luck, friends. Now next I started cutting down the parts for the sofa base. The sofa is a 2-seater love seat, and the cushions are held up on wooden slats that are attached to the base. I cut the front, side, and center parts to size using my stop block to get repeatable cuts as needed. I also went ahead and moved in the stop block and cut the lower back rails to size so I could drill all my pocket holes at once. Now the base is attached with a series of pocket holes which are all on the underside and won't be seen in the final piece. I'm using the Kreg K5 to drill them all, but using the HD attachment here would be a great way to really strengthen the joints even more. I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm doing to beef up this design versus the chair when I assemble it. I clamped the sides and front down to the bench and I attached them together with exterior grade pocket screws. Now with the sides attached, I could use the back rails to position the center support. I put them flush against the sides and the centerpiece fit perfectly in between them. And next I started on the back of the love seat. The back has 3 uprights that attach to the sides and center of the base and are connected at the top by 2 top rails. The top rails are 1.5 inches on each side for a slimmer look. I ripped these parts from wider boards and then cut them down to size on the miter saw. And then I grabbed a few more boards for the next step. I measured in on the part to where the angle would start, and I used my carpenter square to mark a 15-degree angle. And then I went over to the miter saw and I set it to 15 degrees for the cut. And now I could use the laser alignment on the miter saw or just the blade to pull the pencil line right up to where that blade would cut. Now, holding the wood in place, I moved the stop block in so that I could cut all the uprights the same length. I cut that third upright to size, and then I took them to the bench to continue shaping them. The 15-degree cut gave me the recline, but now I needed a flat face to connect it to the base. I used my combination square to draw a line at 90 degrees to the angle that I had just cut. And here's a little visual of how it's going to turn out when I'm done. Now I extended the lines around the edges to give me a reference for the tapering jig here as well. Using those layout lines, setting up the cut on the jig was really pretty easy. I just put the front of the cut and the back of the cut right on the edge of the jig and then locked it down. Then I could raise up the blade and I was ready to go.
All right, I've got the cut all set up on the tapering jig. I have a video on how to build this fancy jig as well as a simpler one. You can check that out after you're done with this video. I'm gonna also use this jig to cut a taper on the back of the leg. That's just to slim it down and make it look a little more sleek, because that's what we're going for. Let's cut it.
I am really loving this new fancy tapering jig that I made, since the repeatability is a lot easier to adjust. After making one cut, I loosen the hold downs and then put the next part on. It gives me the same exact shape on every piece. The last thing I wanted to do was taper the upright down to 1.5 inches at the top so I could match the top rails. I adjusted the jig to make a full width cut at the base up to a half width cut at the top. Now, the back uprights really won't be seen a lot since the cushions are going to be covering them, but they'll still be seen from the side, and I think it's a great look. Now, if you want all the dimensions, cut list, and detailed instructions for this build, I do have plans available. Just go check the link below in the description for details. I'd forgotten to drill pocket holes in the top rails earlier, so I went ahead and did that now. On the ends where they meet the center upright, I offset the holes on each rail similar to how I did on the base so that the screws won't collide. I attached the top rails to one set of the uprights first, making sure that the offset pocket holes were on that center upright. Now, the rail is tilted 15 degrees to match the slope of the back, so I used some little wedges to hold it in place and then secured it with screws. And then I added the next rail and upright, and I had to use my longest clamp here. Now, if you've got at least one clamp over 4.5 feet long, it's going to make several of these steps in the assembly a lot easier. And next I flipped the assembly around and I attached the lower rails. The location of these aren't as important as the top rails, so definitely start with the top first so you can establish that straight top edge along the back of the sofa.
All right, I'm ready to assemble this, and as you can see, it's already up here. I did this for a dry fit. When you've got something like this with so many angles, it's always a great idea to do a dry fit, and because my workbench is so small, I had to get some help. So I'm gonna take this apart, and I'm gonna get my helper, my wife, to help me out, and this is gonna be awesome. If you don't have a wife, you know, like, I can give you some good dating advice, but we'll leave that to you on your own.
I had Susan holding the back assembly as I put glue on the base and got everything set up. Now, she brought it over and I added glue to it as well, and then got everything squared up on the ends with that long clamp. I used some small clamping wedges to get a squeeze on the uprights, and that back angle worked out to right about 12 degrees. After clamping everything together, I secured the uprights with 2.5-inch pocket screws. And on a side note here, as I record this, it's me and Susan's 15th wedding anniversary. She's amazing, and you know you've really found a winner when your wife holds your glue-ups for you and looks genuinely excited about it. Love you, babe. And next I grabbed some boards from the darker beam. Unfortunately, the two beams didn't match exactly, but I was able to get pretty much the entire base from the lighter one, and I'll make the sides from the darker. I ripped the boards down a little smaller than the base, and I wanted the sides to be thinner and have a little subtle taper to them as well. Now each side is pretty simple. It's just two legs connected by an armrest. And unlike the base, I had plenty of material for the sides, so I cut the 6 parts to rough length first. Now, the legs and armrest are joined with 45-degree miters. I set up the saw for the cut and I started with the legs. I marked for the miter cut on the leg and then lined it up with the blade. Then I brought in the stop block to set my repeatable cuts for the other legs as well. I typically don't use the hold down on my miter saw, but when I'm doing miters, I do. Now, since the miter cut is at an angle to the fence, the blade has a tendency to pull that piece into the cut, and that'll make a sloppy joint. So clamping down the parts and holding them tight together is going to give better results in my experience.
I got all 4 chair legs cut to size and the miter on the top, but they are a bit blocky. So what I do want to do is put a taper on these as well. I'm gonna go back to the table saw to do that, and after that I can cut the tops and then assemble the sides, and we'll have it all ready for final assembly.
I went back to my new friend, the fancy tapering jig, for these cuts. Now seriously though, I can't believe it took me this long to make this thing. Now when I made the chairs, I was super gluing alignment blocks to my old jig for repeatability. It's kind of like in high school when I upgraded from my dad's 1980 Toyota Corolla with no power steering to my 1990 Mazda MX-6 GT Turbo.
A new car!
Of course, the MX-6 had like 60,000 miles on it, and the turbo blew out 3 months later. But who's counting? Now with the legs done, I cut the armrests. There's no tapering on these, just 45-degree miters on each end. I like to keep my blade swung to one side to cut all the miters. When you get your setup locked in, you really don't want to move it if you don't have to. Now, miter joints are notoriously weak with just glue, and for a clean look, I'm going with dowel joinery here. I matched up each miter connection, and I drew 2 reference lines across the joints. And then I used a self-centering dowel jig to register against the mitered face and to drill the holes. The jig has a positioning line on it that you line up with your reference marks so that after you've drilled the holes on both sides, they match up perfectly. And just take your time here when clamping it down though. I found that looking at it from further away with both eyes is better than getting close and squinting at it with one eye shut. But if all goes well, it should fit together like a glove.
All the dowel holes are drilled and the legs are ready to be assembled, but there's one thing that I need to do first, and it's going to really help with the strength of the joint. Now, end grain on a miter joint is very porous, so if we put wood glue directly on it, if I could get this top open. Oh my gosh. Seriously, if somebody could invent a better top for a wood glue bottle, you'd be a millionaire. All right. We're gonna hit the easy button on this. Maybe not so much. My gosh. Ah, there we go. Comment down below on what workout regimen you think I should use so that I can actually open a bottle of glue. All right, so if we put this straight onto the block and wipe it in, what you'll see is that it soaks in very fast. And as that does, then all of that strength of the glue is getting sucked in, so it's not there on the surface. There's not enough glue to hold that joint together. So the way that you can avoid that is by what they call glue sizing. And that is basically just a mixture of glue and water. So I'm gonna mix some glue into this little cup of water that I have, and then I'm gonna apply it to all the ends, let that dry, and then I can go on top of that, and it won't suck into the grain as much, and it's gonna be a much stronger joint.
I brushed the glue sizing onto the end grain and it soaked right in there. I started with a silicone glue brush but changed over to a small acid brush, which worked way better. After a few minutes I came back with full strength exterior wood glue on the joints. And once you get the glue on the dowels, you really need to work fast here. The water in the glue will swell the dowels and makes putting them together in the holes you drilled a bit more difficult. But if you can't get them fully seated by hand, don't worry about it, as you can pull the joints together with clamps. I would typically use a web clamp for miters, but with one side open, that doesn't work here. So I tried to put a clamp across the top of the legs to just close up that joint. It was pretty finicky though, as too much pressure pulls the joint apart at the top. So just work with it until you have a solid connection and good glue squeeze out. I let the sides dry overnight, and the next day I came back and laid out some rounded corners on the armrests. A bottle cap here was just the right size curve that I wanted. I nipped off the bulk of the corner with the bandsaw just to reduce sanding time. Then I went over to my oscillating spindle sander and I sanded to the lines that I'd drawn. I gotta say, I really enjoy using this tool. It's very zen just working the curve back and forth until you hit that line. Now to finish off the side assemblies, I took them over to the router table to put a round over on everything. Now the round over pairs really well with the tapers and the rounded corners of the armrests. When working with awkwardly shaped pieces like this, it's nice to have this big tabletop to guide the parts around. Now the only parts left to make were the slats and the cleats for the seat supports.
I cut down some boards for the slats, and once I get those finished up, I can start finishing everything before assembly. But I'm gonna take these, and actually these are gonna be 2x4s. I'm gonna rip them in half and make 1x4s. I'm gonna do that on my jet milling machines between the bandsaw and the planer, and then hitting them on the router for a rounded edge. It's awesome to have your own machine so that you can take lumber like this and turn it into whatever you want. So if you wanna find out more about the jet machines that I use, you can check the links down below in the description. And I wanna give a big thank you to Jet for being a long-term sponsor of my channel.
I cut some small parts for the cleats to mount the slats to, and then I prepped everything for finish. I added roundovers to the seat assembly with a palm router since it's way too big for the router table, and then I sanded everything to 220 grit. I used the random orbital sander where I could, and then smoothed over everything else by hand. I had foresight to drill the mounting holes on the cleats before finishing, but somehow I forgot to do the slats as well.
I'm all set up for finish and I've got things everywhere in the shop. There's a lot of parts to do and I didn't assemble them because I have the cleats and the slats separate, and it's just going to be way easier to apply finish with a brush because it's not going to be in there and making the little nooks and crannies. Now the only difference is if you're spraying, then go ahead and you can attach those because you can spray into the little corners and crevices. But if you're not spraying, finish first and then you can get to assembly later.
Now the finishing was a 3-step process. I'm using Total Boat marine varnishes for the finish, which I've had good results with in the past. It's the same stuff that I used on my chair. I started off with Gleam 2.0 in gloss, thinned down 50/50 with their brushing thinner. Now this is just to seal the wood and get a good base coat for the next one. Now, I applied everything with a foam brush, which worked well for me, and watching the cedar come to life never gets old. About an hour later it had dried and I came back with a full strength coat of the Gleam gloss. Now, one of the things that I like about this product is how fast it dries, and it lets me do several coats in one day. Now, another couple hours later, I came back with a full-strength coat of their Lust Matte finish. Now, a couple things to note here. It is very thick, so have a raking light to check for dry spots as it tends to drag. And it's very strong. I highly recommend a VOC respirator when applying all these finishes or doing it outside.
The finish turned out great and I'm ready to assemble, but again, the bench is too small so I can't assemble it because the legs would hang off the bench. So I moved it out of the way and I put a sheet of plywood down on the floor, and now I'm going to assemble on top of that. That just gives me a nice smooth reference surface where I know everything's going to be pretty much in the same plane.
Now assembly can be a little tricky, but with the right setup, it will go smoothly. I marked the legs where I wanted the bottom of the seat assembly to rest, and I made some small marks there. Then I put a piece of painter's tape along that line on each leg. I used that tape to position a cutoff from the project that spanned both legs, and I clamped it in place across both of them. And then I propped up the sides so that the clamps wouldn't hit the ground and laid the base right on top of it. I used a scrap block to get the front of the base flush with that front leg, and then I clamped the base to the side where it touches the uprights. Susan came over to help me again and held the other side in place while I tilted the base onto that temporary support. Now, if you don't have a helper, you could just stand this thing up by sliding some clamps on the bottom of the legs, but it's going to be way easier with an extra set of hands. I flushed up that side and I checked the other one again, and I made some minor adjustments to get everything in place. And the whole assembly was squeezed together with the long clamp again, and I secured it with 2.5-inch pocket screws. Now, to attach the upright to the side, I'm using 2.5-inch number 10 screws here. Now, you could also use dowels if you'd like. I put a 2-inch piece of blue tape on the upright to show where the armrest was on the other side. I made marks along the upright for 3 screws, keeping them far enough away from the edge to prevent any blowout. And next I pre-drilled the holes and countersunk them so the heads would be below the surface. I drove them all in while keeping the parts clamped tight together. I didn't feel great about the smaller diameter screws on the front legs, so I pulled them out and I replaced them with those number 10 screws. Now they don't have a pan head though, so I'd really recommend using the Craig HD system here or finding number 10 screws with pan heads, which I'm going to be looking for. Now, the final step was to put the slats on to support the cushions. I drilled countersunk holes in the slats at the drill press, and since there were 18 of them to drill out, I set up a fence with some little visual stops so that I could easily position each hole as I drilled it. Now the cleats get attached with 1.5-inch screws to the sides and uprights. I clamped the cleats in place, and then I moved them until the slats would be just flush with the seat base, and then drove the screws in. I repeated the process for the uprights, and I was ready for the slats. Small spacers helped me position the parts, and I screwed them down with 1.25-inch screws into the cleats. Now this thing's looking nice. This could make a pretty cool all-wood love seat as well. We got these cushions from At Home, and we had bought 4 extra ones when we made the chairs because we knew we'd be making this part too. Now this little love seat really finishes off our front porch, but it could also look awesome as indoor furniture too.
If you want to see the other outdoor furniture I've built, I got a playlist queued up for you right there. If you want plans for this one, I got them right down below in the description. I want to give a big thank you to all the people joining the Builders Club. You can get more information on that as well, and I'll check you on the next video.